Hello again everyone, and today I'll be looking at an updated version of a classic Samyang lens, their new MF 85mm F1.4 Mark II. It's for full frame or APS-C digital SLR cameras, but can also be adapted onto mirrorless cameras. So far it looks like it's going to be available in Canon EF, Nikon F and Sony E mounts, and it'll cost about £360 in the UK or around $400 US, potentially good value for money. I'd like to thank Samyang for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. We'll be looking at both its strengths and its weaknesses. This lens has the same optics inside it as previous versions of Samyang's popular 85mm F1.4 manual focus lens, which means that I've actually tested the optics of this lens 2 times already in its previous forms, once on an old 20 megapixel Canon 6D and once on a 30 megapixel Canon EOS R. And it still has tons of potential as an inexpensive portrait lens with a reasonable amount of sharpness and with very soft bokeh. It's an old optical design now, but still a very popular one. What's new to this lens is its build quality, and we see a number of very nice improvements over previous versions. It's still manual focus and manual aperture, which will slow you down a bit and beginners might find that tricky. But the build quality feels much more solid than before, featuring a bit more metal in the construction of its body and a weather sealing gasket around the lens mount to help keep out dust and moisture. Most of the markings on the barrel are etched in and the design looks really modern. It also features a newly designed aperture ring, which can be set to either click at every half stop of aperture or to turn smoothly. That could be useful for video makers, although on my copy of the lens it didn't actually turn all that smoothly. Next comes the focus ring, which turns nice and precisely, smoothly and a little more heavily than previous versions, being beautifully well damped, and it's rubberized with a nice micro pattern. We get a hyperfocal scale here too, which is nice. It's a little optimistic in its measurement though. If you're using a very high resolution camera, then you'll want to be a little more precise than it suggests. As you focus more closely, the lens zooms in just a little bit as you do so there is a little focus breathing to be seen here. The lens's filter thread size is 72mm and it comes with a symbol hood. The iris mechanism has 9 aperture blades for smoother bokeh when the lens is topped down. Overall, the design changes of this Mark II version of the lens are really positive, and its fit and finish is fantastic. It feels great to use, and I like the precision of the manual focus ring. That's particularly useful as manually focusing an 85mm F1.4 lens is not the easiest thing in the world. Well, let's move on and take a look at image quality. As I've mentioned, I already tested this lens's optics in its previous forms on a 20 and a 30 megapixel camera, so let's really challenge it now by adapting it onto my 42 megapixel full frame Sony a7R II. At f1.4 in the middle of the image, sharpness is reasonably good, but we see somewhat low contrast and some purple fringing on highly contrasting edges. The good news though is that corner image quality isn't any softer, although colour fringing is still visible. If you stop down to f2, then we see a small increase in brightness and contrast in those corners, and lots more sharpness and contrast over in the middle. Stop down to f2.8 and image quality in the middle is almost perfect, although just a tiny bit of purple fringing is still visible there. That goes away if you stop down a bit further. The corners look about the same as before though. Stop down to f4 for more sharpness there, and f5.6 sees a further tiny improvement. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, where the effects of diffraction begin to soften the image. So overall, it's the same image quality as before. The lens is reasonably sharp across the image frames straight from f1.4, although stop down the aperture to f2 for a lot more contrast, and stop down to f4 for excellent image quality from corner to corner. I'm not going to test the lens on an APS-C camera this time, as I've done it before in previous reviews, and honestly, you'd probably be better off getting a lens specifically designed for APS-C cameras instead. If you really want it to be a Samyang lens, then their 85mm F1.2 will be a really nice option, although of course there are endless others on the market. When it comes to distortion and vignetting, the lens projects almost no distortion, but vignetting is a little heavy at f1.4, the corners brighten up at f2, and at f2.8 we see fairly even brightness across the image frame. When it comes to close-up image quality, unfortunately this lens still cannot get you very close to your subject, focusing only down to 1.1 meters. I really wish it could get closer. Image quality at f1.4 there is a tiny bit softer than at normal distances, although we see good improvements at f2 and f2.8, where sharpness and contrast look great now. Let's see how well the lens works against bright lights. It's a below average performance here, with quite a bit of flaring getting into your images when bright lights are nearby. You should use the lens's hood whenever you can. Now let's take a look at this lens's bokeh, something that previous versions were well known for. Considering that the optics are the same, you won't be surprised to discover that the lens's out of focus backgrounds still look really soft. The bokeh looks lovely and smooth actually in virtually all situations, a real strong point of this design. And related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration, or colour fringing on bokeh highlights. The fringing is strong with this one. At f1.4 we see lots of green and purple in the picture. Even at f2.8 we still see some there, although at f4 it's mostly gone. Okay then, what can we say overall? The lens's optical design is definitely pretty old now, and it's certainly not the sharpest portrait lens out there, but it's still sharp enough for most users, and it still manages to get you beautifully out of focus backgrounds in your pictures. The lens's build quality is excellent, with some genuinely nice little improvements over the previous versions, although if you're a beginner, I'll warn you that manually focusing this lens will take a little getting used to. And as I mentioned, I really wish that it could focus down a bit closer to your subject. What I'm really pleased about though is its price. £360 for a full frame f1.4 portrait lens is very good value for money, so it still comes recommended.